I stood in that pristine courthouse conference room, adjusting my expensive charcoal suit as two desperate middle-aged clients entered through the polished oak doors. My mother clutched a crumpled tissue with trembling fingers, her graying hair unkempt and eyes red from sleepless nights. My father's weathered hands shook uncontrollably as they both begged me to save their remaining son from a 20-year prison sentence. Neither parent recognized the successful defense attorney their worthless son had become the child they disowned and exiled 8 years ago, the one they blamed for everything. 8 years earlier, I was 20 years old, working 2 jobs while attending Jefferson Community College in our small Ohio town. Every morning at 5, I'd clock in at Morrison's Family Restaurant, washing dishes and scraping grease from industrial pans until my hands cracked and bled. After classes, I'd rush to my night security guard position at Westfield Shopping Plaza, walking empty corridors until dawn, studying criminal justice textbooks by flashlight between hourly rounds. My parents, Carol and Robert, had always favored my younger brother Dylan. At 18, he was their golden child, the star quarterback with college scholarship potential, who never caused trouble. They saw him as their ticket to respectability in our working-class neighborhood, while I represented everything they wanted to forget about their struggles. Despite working myself to exhaustion, I was constantly criticized. When Dylan came home past curfew, they blamed my influence. When he received detention for skipping class, they claimed I was teaching him bad habits. Every family gathering became an opportunity to highlight Dylan's achievements, while dismissing my efforts to better myself through education. That cold February night, everything changed. Police sirens wailed through our quiet street at 3 in the morning, their red and blue lights painting our aluminum siding in harsh colors. Officers with bulletproof vests and flashlights surrounded our modest ranch house, shouting commands through megaphones that woke every neighbor within 6 blocks. The battering ram splintered our front door into jagged pieces. Armed officers flooded our living room, overturning furniture and dumping drawers onto the carpet. In Dylan's bedroom, they discovered 2 pounds of cocaine, wrapped in plastic bags, digital scales still powdered with residue $17,000, in crumpled bills stuffed inside his mattress, and customer lists written in his neat handwriting. My parents stood frozen in their bathrobes watching their perfect son handcuffed and read his Miranda rights. Carol's face went white as paper when officers explained the evidence. Robert's jaw dropped when detectives described the sophisticated drug operation Dylan had been running from their basement for over 6 months. But within hours, their shock transformed into something more familiar: blame directed at me. Carol cornered me in the kitchen, while Robert paced the living room, both convinced I was somehow responsible for their golden child's downfall. "You corrupted him," my mother hissed, her voice dripping with venom I'd never heard before. "This is your fault. You taught him this filthy business. He was innocent before you poisoned his mind with your criminal ideas." I stared at her in disbelief. "Mom, I knew nothing about this. I've been working 60-hour weeks and studying. I'm hardly ever home. How could I have influenced anything Dylan was doing?" But my words fell on deaf ears. They had already constructed their narrative, one that preserved Dylan's image as the victim, while casting me as the corrupt older brother who led him astray. The truth was irrelevant when it conflicted with their desperate need to believe in Dylan's innocence. Our neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, witnessed the heated arguments that followed. She later told others how she heard Carol screaming accusations through our thin walls, demanding I confess to corrupting Dylan. Robert's voice carried across the yard as he threatened to disown me if I didn't take responsibility for destroying their family's reputation. Uncle Frank, my father's estranged brother who lived in Wyoming, called that week to check on us after hearing about the arrest. He was the only family member who questioned whether blaming me made any logical sense given my work schedule and academic focus. The first family meeting occurred 3 days after Dylan's arrest. My parents sat across from me at our scarred kitchen table, their faces hard with resolve. They refused to consider any explanation that didn't center on my guilt. In their minds, I had somehow masterminded Dylan's drug operation while working full-time, and maintaining a 3.7 grade point average. Dylan himself sealed my fate during his first jail visit. Desperate to reduce his potential sentence and maintain our parents' love, he confirmed their suspicions by claiming I had introduced him to drug dealing. He spun elaborate lies about me teaching him how to weigh products and recruit customer stories that perfectly aligned with what our parents wanted to hear. My genuine love for our family made this betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. Despite years of favoritism and criticism, I had always hoped to earn their respect through my achievements. Watching them choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths shattered something fundamental inside me. The escalating tension reached a breaking point when Dylan's attorney suggested making me a scapegoat to reduce his client's charges. My parents embraced this strategy eagerly, seeing it as confirmation of their beliefs, rather than a manipulative legal tactic designed to save their precious son. The climactic moment came during Dylan's second jail visit, when he looked our parents in the eye and swore I was the mastermind behind his entire operation. He claimed I had threatened him into silence and used him as my street-level dealer. Every word was a calculated lie, designed to preserve his image as their victim, rather than accept responsibility for his choices. My parents believed every single fabrication. What happened next went beyond simple blame. My parents launched a systematic campaign to destroy every aspect of my life, convinced they were protecting Dylan from my corrupting influence. Carol called Jefferson Community College the next morning, speaking with Dean Williams in her most concerned mother voice. She explained that her son Caden was involved in drug trafficking and posed a danger to other students. She provided specific details about Dylan's arrest, claiming I was the actual dealer who had escaped prosecution. The dean suspended me immediately pending a full investigation. Robert visited both my employers that same afternoon. At Morrison's family restaurant, he told the manager that I was under investigation for drug trafficking and would likely be arrested soon. He suggested they terminate my employment to protect their establishment's reputation. The manager, Mr. Garcia, had known me for 2 years and seen my work ethic firsthand, but he couldn't risk his business becoming associated with drug crimes. At Westfield Shopping Plaza, my father painted an even darker picture. He claimed I had been using my security access to facilitate drug deals, after hours turning their property into a criminal enterprise. The security chief fired me on the spot, confiscating my uniform and badge before escorting me from the premises like a common criminal. But the financial warfare proved most devastating. Our joint bank account contained $8,400 I had saved from years of double shifts and overtime hours. Every penny was earmarked for completing my degree and transferring to a 4-year university. Carol froze the account that afternoon, claiming the money was evidence of drug proceeds that needed protection from law enforcement seizure. The expensive criminal defense attorney they hired for Dylan, a sharp-dressed man named Hamilton Pierce, actively encouraged this strategy. He explained that making me the scapegoat would minimize Dylan's exposure and potentially reduce his charges from trafficking to simple possession. Pierce advised my parents to gather evidence of my supposed corruption and present it to prosecutors as a bargaining chip. Carol began calling my classmates and friends, sharing carefully crafted stories about my criminal associations. She contacted Jenny Morrison, my study partner, in our constitutional law course, claiming I had tried to recruit her into drug sales. She called Marcus Thompson, my lab partner in criminal procedure, warning his parents that I was dangerous and unstable. She reached out to Professor Anderson, who taught my criminology class, suggesting that my interest in criminal justice stemmed from personal experience rather than academic curiosity. She painted my excellent grades as evidence of insider knowledge rather than dedicated studying. Robert focused on destroying my reputation within our community. He visited Coach Martinez at the local high school, where I had volunteered as an assistant coach for their debate team. He told the coach that I was grooming students for criminal recruitment, turning my mentorship into something sinister and predatory. He spoke with Reverend Williams at our family church, claiming I had been living a double life while pretending to be a devoted young man. He suggested that my regular attendance was a cover for criminal activities poisoning even my spiritual sanctuary against me. The systematic destruction spread like wildfire through our small town. Within a week, former friends crossed streets to avoid me. Classmates whispered and pointed when I walked through campus hallways. Neighbors who had known me since childhood suddenly viewed me with suspicion and fear. Ms. Rodriguez, my high school guidance counselor, tried to defend me when my parents contacted her. She remembered my dedication to academics and community service, questioning how such a responsible young man could suddenly become a criminal mastermind. But her voice was drowned out by the chorus of accusations. Our family attorney, Mr. Gonzalez, privately expressed doubts about my supposed guilt to my father. He had handled legal matters for our family for 15 years and knew my character well. But Robert dismissed these concerns, insisting that Gonzalez simply didn't understand the evidence against me. Meanwhile, Dylan enjoyed his newfound status as the victim rather than the perpetrator. From his jail cell, he continued embellishing stories that portrayed him as an innocent younger brother, led astray by his corrupt sibling. Each conversation with our parents reinforced their belief that saving Dylan required destroying me completely. Carol systematically erased my presence from our home. She threw away my childhood photos, donated my clothes to charity, and removed every trace of my existence from our family albums. She told neighbors who asked that she was dealing with the painful reminders of my betrayal. Robert, despite harboring private doubts about this extreme response, chose family unity over truth. He convinced himself that supporting Carol's crusade was necessary to save their marriage and their remaining son. His weakness in the face of her vindictiveness sealed my fate. The police, influenced by my family's accusations and Dylan's testimony, began treating me as a suspect rather than a witness. Detective Harrison visited my former workplace and college, asking pointed questions about my behavior and associations. The investigation that should have focused on Dylan's crimes gradually shifted toward building a case against me. My attempts to defend myself only made things worse. Every piece of evidence I presented, every character reference I offered, was dismissed as elaborate deception. When I showed them my work schedules, proving I couldn't have been involved in Dylan's operation, they claimed I was using legitimate employment as a cover. When I presented my academic records demonstrating consistent achievement, they suggested my criminal justice studies were research for my drug business. No evidence could penetrate their determination to believe in my guilt and Dylan's innocence. The climactic revelation came when I discovered that my parents had already contacted Uncle Frank in Wyoming, arranging for my permanent exile. They had painted me as dangerous and unstable, claiming I needed intervention away from bad influences. Frank had agreed to take me in, believing he was helping with rehabilitation, rather than enabling a family's systematic scapegoating. My parents had planned my disappearance months before they revealed it to me. The ultimatum arrived on a gray March morning that matched the bleakness of my situation. Carol and Robert summoned me to the kitchen table, their faces stone cold with finality. They had made their decision without input, debate, or consideration of any perspective beyond their own. "You have 24 hours to leave this state permanently," Robert announced, his voice devoid of any paternal warmth. "Uncle Frank has agreed to take you in Wyoming. If you refuse, we'll press charges against you for Dylan's crimes. Hamilton Pierce has enough evidence to make the charges stick." The threat wasn't empty. Pierce had spent weeks building a circumstantial case that portrayed me as the mastermind behind Dylan's operation. My criminal justice studies became evidence of criminal planning. My work schedule became an alibi for secret meetings. My savings became proof of drug profits. I was allowed exactly one suitcase for belongings accumulated over 20 years of life. Carol supervised the packing with military precision, rejecting sentimental items like photo albums or childhood mementos. She confiscated my car keys, claiming the vehicle was evidence in their case against me. My driver's license, birth certificate, and social security card disappeared into her purse. "You'll get these back when Frank confirms you're staying put," she said, her voice flat and businesslike. The bus station goodbye was worse than no farewell at all. Robert dropped me at the Greyhound terminal, like discarding unwanted cargo, refusing to meet my eyes or acknowledge my attempts to reason with him. He handed me $50 in crumpled bills and Uncle Frank's address written on torn notebook paper. "Don't try to contact us," were his final words before driving away without looking back. The 36-hour bus ride to Cheyenne gave me time to process the complete destruction of everything I had known. Fellow passengers noticed my red eyes and offered tissues or kind words, but I couldn't explain that I was mourning the death of my entire identity. Uncle Frank's ranch sat 2 hours east of Cheyenne, accessible only by gravel roads that disappeared into endless Wyoming grassland. The isolation was absolute, broken only by the distant outline of mountains and the constant whisper of wind through prairie grass. Frank himself proved nothing like what I expected. Where Robert was weak and easily manipulated, Frank radiated quiet strength. Where my parents were emotional and reactive, he demonstrated thoughtful consideration. But he had accepted their story completely, believing he was helping rehabilitate a troubled young man who had fallen into drug addiction and criminal behavior. "Your parents told me you've been running with a bad crowd," he said gently, showing me to a spare bedroom that would become my sanctuary. "Said you needed tough love away from those influences. I'm here to help you get clean and find your direction." His kindness made the situation more painful. Frank had opened his home to what he believed was his nephew's criminal son, accepting responsibility for my rehabilitation based on my parents' fabrications. He installed additional phone restrictions and monitored my communications, genuinely believing he was protecting my recovery. Back in Ohio, my parents were implementing the final phase of their plan. Carol changed our home phone number, ensuring I couldn't contact anyone in our community. Robert collected my mail and returned letters unopened, cutting off communication with former classmates and professors who might have offered support. But their cruelty extended beyond simple isolation. Within weeks of my departure, they began spreading rumors that I had died in a drug-related accident out west. Carol told Mrs. Patterson that they had received tragic news from law enforcement about my overdose. Robert informed our church congregation that their family was mourning the loss of their son to addiction. The lies grew more elaborate over time. They claimed my body couldn't be transported home due to the ongoing investigation into my criminal associates. They accepted condolences from neighbors who brought casseroles and sympathy cards. They even held a small memorial service at our church, displaying childhood photos and accepting donations for a fictional drug addiction recovery program. Meanwhile, Dylan's criminal case moved forward with reduced charges thanks to his cooperation against his supposedly dead brother. The prosecutor accepted a plea bargain that sentenced him to only 6 months in minimum security detention, followed by community service and probation. The deal was contingent on his continued testimony about my supposed role as the operations mastermind. My parents sold my car to help pay Dylan's legal fees, pocketing the $3,000 it brought at auction. They donated my remaining belongings to charity, claiming they couldn't bear the painful reminders of their lost son. Every trace of my existence was methodically erased from their lives. The legal consequences of their lies made any return to Ohio impossible. Police had issued a warrant for my arrest based on Dylan's testimony and my parents' accusations. Detective Harrison closed the case by listing me as a fugitive who had fled to avoid prosecution, noting that my apparent death eliminated the need for further investigation. Uncle Frank began noticing inconsistencies between my behavior and my parents' description within the first month. I showed no signs of drug withdrawal, exhibited no criminal tendencies, and demonstrated work ethic that impressed even his ranch hands. My knowledge of criminal justice came from academic study rather than street experience, and my goals remained focused on education and legitimate success. But the damage was complete. I had lost my family, my education, my savings, my community, and my legal identity. According to official records, Caden Morrison had died in Wyoming, another victim of the drug epidemic that plagued young Americans. Rock bottom arrived when I attempted to contact Sarah Mitchell, my closest friend since elementary school. Using Frank's phone, I called her family home desperate to connect with someone who knew the real me. Her mother answered with a gasp, claiming she was hearing from a ghost. "Caden died months ago," she whispered. "We attended his memorial service. How is this possible?" The conversation ended abruptly, leaving me to realize that my parents had successfully killed me socially and legally, while I remained physically alive. They had achieved the perfect crime, eliminating their problem child while maintaining sympathy as grieving parents. Frank's ranch became my tomb and my salvation. The physical isolation forced me to confront the depth of my family's betrayal, while the demanding work provided structure for rebuilding my shattered sense of self. Each day brought the same routine: sunrise chores, afternoon maintenance, evening bookkeeping, and long nights studying by lamplight in my small room. The climactic discovery came 6 months later, when I found an old newspaper article online during my limited internet access. Dylan had been arrested again, this time for assault and battery outside a local bar. The charges were serious, carrying potential jail time that could violate his probation from the drug case. But our parents refused to help him this time. They had spent all their savings on his first legal defense and the elaborate charade of my death. The memorial service, the false grief counseling, and the legal fees had drained their resources completely. Dylan sat in county jail, abandoned by the same parents who had sacrificed everything to protect him. Justice was beginning to serve itself. 2 years of Wyoming isolation had transformed me completely. Uncle Frank's ranch demanded physical strength I had never possessed, mental toughness I had never needed, and emotional resilience I was forced to develop. The scrawny college student who arrived with a single suitcase had evolved into a man capable of handling 12-hour workdays in brutal weather. Frank himself had undergone a transformation regarding my character. Daily observation revealed someone entirely different from the troubled criminal my parents had described. I showed up early for every task, stayed late to ensure completion, and approached ranch management with the same analytical mind I had once applied to legal studies. "You're nothing like what they told me," he admitted one evening as we repaired fence posts in fading light. "Either you're the best actor I've ever met, or your parents were completely wrong about who you are." The breakthrough came when Frank offered to help me pursue education again. He had watched me study outdated textbooks by lamplight, seen me calculate feed costs with mathematical precision, and witnessed my natural leadership with seasonal ranch hands. Despite my parents' warnings about supporting my supposed addiction, he began questioning whether they had told him the truth. Using the ranch's satellite internet connection, I researched GED requirements and online testing options. The Wyoming Department of Education allowed me to take the exam in Cheyenne, using Frank's address as my legal residence. My criminal justice background translated into excellent performance on the social studies portion, while ranch mathematics had sharpened my quantitative skills. I scored in the 97th percentile, earning not just my high school equivalency, but qualification for academic scholarships at state universities. Frank drove me to the testing center himself, his pride evident as we received the results that day. College applications required creativity, given my unusual circumstances. Frank helped me obtain replacement identification documents, establishing my legal residence at his ranch address. My personal essay focused on overcoming adversity, without revealing the full extent of my family's betrayal, describing my experience as a young man who had learned harsh lessons about trust and resilience. The University of Wyoming offered me a full academic scholarship based on my GED scores, personal statement, and Frank's character reference as my guardian. The financial aid package covered tuition books and dormitory housing, removing any barrier to completing my education. I chose pre-law as my major without hesitation. The injustice I had experienced firsthand motivated every class, every assignment, every late-night study session. I understood how easily the legal system could be manipulated by those with resources and connections, and I wanted to develop skills to protect others facing similar circumstances. The work-study balance required careful planning. I returned to the ranch every weekend and holiday helping Frank with seasonal operations while maintaining perfect grades during the academic year. The physical labor kept me grounded, while intellectual challenges provided purpose beyond mere survival. Meanwhile, my family's situation continued deteriorating in ways I discovered through careful internet searches. Dylan's pattern of criminal behavior had accelerated rather than improved after his light sentence. Court records showed arrests for driving under the influence, possession of controlled substances, theft, and domestic violence. Each new charge brought harsher penalties, as judges lost patience with his repeated violations. My parents had mortgaged their house to pay for Dylan's mounting legal fees, borrowing against the equity Robert had built during 30 years of factory work. Carol had taken a second job as a grocery store cashier, working nights and weekends to supplement their shrinking income. The golden child, whose potential had justified destroying their other son, was systematically destroying them in return. Public records revealed the full extent of their financial ruin. They had borrowed $47,000 against their home's value, drained their retirement accounts, and maxed out credit cards to fund Dylan's legal defense. The comfortable middle-class life they had built was crumbling under the weight of their poor choices. Community sentiment had shifted dramatically as Dylan's behavior became impossible to ignore. Neighbors who had once sympathized with my parents' loss began questioning the memorial service for their supposedly dead son. Former friends wondered aloud whether they had been too hasty in judging me based on family accusations rather than personal knowledge. My acceptance to law school at the University of Denver represented another milestone in my journey toward justice. The criminal defense program was among the nation's best, exactly what I needed to develop expertise in protecting innocent people from false accusations and family betrayal. Frank offered to pay the remaining costs, not covered by my partial scholarship, treating my education as an investment in both my future and his own legacy. He had come to view me as the son he never had, someone who could carry forward the values of hard work and integrity that defined his character. My relationship with Emma began during our first year of law school. She was studying prosecution, while I focused on defense, creating natural opportunities for debate and discussion about justice, evidence, and the adversarial system. Unlike my family, Emma valued truth over comfort, challenging my arguments while respecting my perspective. I shared my full story with Emma, gradually gauging her reaction to each revelation about my family's betrayal. Rather than pitying me or doubting my version of events, she analyzed the situation with the logical mind that made her an excellent prosecutor. Her conclusion was unambiguous. My parents had committed a form of psychological abuse that bordered on criminal fraud. Law school provided structure for channeling my anger into productive expertise. I specialized in cases involving false accusations, family manipulation, and systemic injustice, developing reputation among professors and classmates for creative defense strategies and thorough preparation. My physical transformation continued as well. Years of ranch work had built muscle mass and confidence that complemented my intellectual growth. The broken 20-year-old who had arrived in Wyoming as an exile had evolved into an imposing young man who commanded respect in academic and social settings. Career planning focused on criminal defense with emphasis on protecting falsely accused defendants. I wanted to build the kind of practice that could have saved me from my family's lies, offering hope to others facing impossible circumstances and manipulative relatives. The climactic moment of this period came when I discovered through online searches that my parents were facing bankruptcy. Dylan's latest arrest for armed robbery carried a potential 20-year sentence, requiring expensive legal representation they could no longer afford. The house mortgage was in default, retirement accounts were empty, and credit cards had reached their limits. They were desperately seeking affordable legal representation for Dylan, having been turned away by top attorneys who demanded retainers they couldn't provide. Court-appointed counsel had suggested they try a young criminal defense lawyer who had built a reputation for taking difficult cases. That lawyer was me, though they had no way of knowing their supposedly dead son had become the successful attorney they needed to save their remaining child. 5 years after fleeing Ohio with nothing but false accusations, I graduated from law school magna cum laude and passed the Colorado bar examination on my first attempt. The transformation from exiled scapegoat to accomplished attorney felt surreal, but every achievement had been earned through dedication that my family's betrayal had intensified rather than diminished. Hawkins Morrison and Associates, one of Denver's most prestigious criminal defense firms, hired me immediately based on my academic record and internship performance. Senior partner Thomas Hawkins recognized my passion for defending falsely accused clients, noting that my trial advocacy skills seemed driven by personal experience rather than mere academic interest. My specialization in cases involving family betrayal and false accusations quickly earned recognition within Colorado's legal community. I developed innovative defense strategies that challenged prosecution narratives built on unreliable family testimony, often exposing underlying motives of manipulation and scapegoating. Legal journals featured articles I authored about defending clients, accused by family members exploring the psychological dynamics that led relatives to fabricate testimony for personal gain. My work attracted attention from defense attorneys nationwide, who consulted on similar cases. High-profile victories built my reputation rapidly. The Morrison versus State case involved a young woman falsely accused of embezzlement by her stepmother, who wanted to eliminate competition for family inheritance. The Richards defense exposed how a father had blamed his son for his own financial crimes to avoid prosecution. Each victory validated my belief that family accusations often masked deeper corruption. Media coverage highlighted my unconventional background and success rate with seemingly impossible cases. Colorado Legal Review profiled me as a rising star in criminal defense, noting my ability to connect with juries and expose prosecution weaknesses that other attorneys missed. My personal life stabilized as well. Emma and I had maintained our relationship throughout law school, despite working opposite sides of the legal system. Her prosecution work focused on protecting genuine victims, while my defense practice concentrated on protecting innocent defendants. We respected each other's commitment to justice, even when our professional roles conflicted. Our engagement came naturally after 3 years together. Emma understood my drive for justice stemmed from personal experience, and she supported my mission to protect others from family betrayal. She had seen how my past motivated, rather than limited, my professional success. Uncle Frank's health began declining during my second year of practice. The cancer diagnosis came suddenly aggressive and widespread beyond surgical intervention. I took extended leave to care for him, returning to Wyoming to manage both his medical needs and ranch operations during his final months. Frank used his remaining time to finalize arrangements that would secure my future. The ranch property, mineral rights, and investments he had accumulated over 40 years would transfer to me upon his death. Recent oil discoveries on neighboring properties had increased his land's value to over $2 million, providing financial independence I had never imagined. "You earned this," he whispered during one of our final conversations. "You showed me what real character looks like when everything else gets stripped away. I'm proud to call you my son." His death was peaceful, but devastating. Frank had become the father figure my biological father had never been, providing guidance, support, and unconditional love during my darkest period. His funeral drew ranchers from across Wyoming, who shared stories about his integrity and kindness. I legally changed my last name to honor Frank's memory, becoming Caden Morrison Frank, rather than maintaining the Morrison surname that connected me to a family that had disowned me. The change also provided practical benefit by making me harder to identify if my parents ever searched for their supposedly dead son. My law practice expanded significantly after Frank's inheritance provided capital for starting my own firm. Morrison Frank Legal Defense specialized in family-related criminal cases, offering hope to clients facing accusations from relatives motivated by greed, jealousy, or self-protection. Private investigators I employed began monitoring my parents' situation in Ohio, providing regular updates about their continued financial decline and Dylan's escalating criminal behavior. The information satisfied my curiosity without requiring direct contact that might reveal my survival. Dylan was facing his most serious charges, yet armed robbery of a convenience store, with clear video evidence, witness testimony, and a prior criminal record that eliminated plea bargaining options. The prosecution was seeking the maximum 20-year sentence, viewing him as a career criminal rather than a misguided youth. My parents had lost their house to foreclosure, moving into a cramped apartment in the worst neighborhood of our former hometown. Carol worked 3 part-time jobs to pay basic living expenses while Robert's factory job provided minimal income. They had exhausted every financial resource supporting Dylan's previous legal troubles. Their desperate search for affordable legal representation had led them through multiple consultations with attorneys who demanded retainers far beyond their means. Court-appointed counsel suggested they contact Morrison Frank Legal Defense, noting that I sometimes took cases at reduced fees based on financial hardship. The receptionist at my firm scheduled their consultation without mentioning my identity, following standard protocol for initial client meetings. She listed them simply as Robert and Carol Morrison, seeking representation for their son, Dylan Morrison's armed robbery charges. I knew exactly who was coming before they walked through my office doors. Years of private investigation had provided detailed information about their situation, their desperation, and their complete ignorance of my survival and success. This was the moment I had unconsciously been preparing for since beginning my legal career. Emma encouraged me to take the case despite the personal complications. She believed confronting my past was necessary for complete healing, and she trusted my professional integrity to handle the situation appropriately, regardless of personal feelings. Security measures were implemented to allow me to observe them before revealing myself. My office featured a conference room with one-way glass, enabling me to watch their arrival and assess their current state before deciding how to proceed. The climactic moment approached when my receptionist buzzed my office. "Mr. Morrison Frank, your 2 o'clock appointment has arrived. The Morrison family is here for their consultation about their son's robbery charges." My parents sat in the waiting area clutching manila folders containing Dylan's court documents. They looked aged, beyond their years, worn down by stress and financial hardship. Carol's hair had turned completely gray, and Robert's once confident posture had collapsed into the defeated slouch of a man whose choices had destroyed everything he valued. They discussed their supposedly dead son, while waiting, wondering aloud whether I would have grown into someone capable of helping Dylan if I hadn't died from addiction. The irony was overwhelming, as they wished for the very person they had systematically destroyed. The conference room felt larger than usual as I stood with my back to the door reviewing Dylan's file one final time. My expensive charcoal suit, Italian leather shoes, and confident posture represented everything my parents had believed I would never become. Their broken son had evolved into exactly the kind of successful professional they had always hoped Dylan might be. Robert and Carol entered hesitantly, overwhelmed by the elegant surroundings that declared their attorney's success. Marble floors, mahogany furniture, and awards lining the walls created an atmosphere of achievement that contrasted sharply with their current circumstances. "Please have a seat," I said, without turning around, keeping my voice professionally neutral. Years of courtroom experience had taught me to control tone and inflection skills that served me well in this moment of ultimate confrontation. They settled into leather chairs across from my desk, clutching Dylan's court documents like lifelines. Carol's hands trembled slightly as she placed the folder on the polished conference table. Robert cleared his throat, nervously, clearly intimidated by the sophisticated environment. "Mr. Morrison Frank." Carol began tentatively. "We appreciate you considering our case. We know our financial situation limits our options, but we're hoping you might help our son despite our circumstances." I continued facing away, studying the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. Downtown Denver spread below us a view that represented the heights I had achieved while they had fallen into poverty. The contrast wasn't lost on me as I prepared to reveal the truth they had hidden from themselves for 8 years. "Tell me about Dylan's charges," I said, maintaining professional distance, while my heart raced with anticipation. Robert opened the folder with shaking hands. Armed robbery of a 7-Eleven on Maple Street. The prosecution has security footage witness statements, and they're claiming he's a career criminal because of his previous arrests. Previous arrests. I repeated, finally turning to face them for the first time. The moment our eyes met, I watched for any sign of recognition. Carol studied my features intently, perhaps noting something familiar, but unable to place the resemblance. Robert squinted slightly as if trying to solve a puzzle he couldn't quite grasp. Neither showed any indication they were looking at their supposedly dead son. Yes, Carol continued, oblivious to the reality of our situation. Dylan has had some troubles with drugs and alcohol over the years. Nothing like this, though. Armed robbery isn't something we ever imagined he would attempt. I sat down slowly, maintaining eye contact, while processing their complete failure to recognize me. 8 years of physical and intellectual development had changed me significantly, but the fundamental structure of my face remained familiar enough that attentive parents should have noticed. Has Dylan always been the problematic child in your family? I asked, testing their response to questions about family dynamics. The question hit them like a physical blow. Carol's eyes filled with tears, while Robert looked away uncomfortably. They clearly hadn't expected their attorney to probe family history so directly. Actually, no, Carol admitted quietly. We had another son who died several years ago. He was the one with problems. Dylan was always the good child until recently. Tell me about your other son. I pressed, leaning forward with professional interest that masked personal devastation. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His name was Caden. He got involved with drugs and corrupted Dylan when they were younger. We blame ourselves for not protecting Dylan from his influence. How did Caden die? The question felt surreal, asking my parents to explain my own supposed death. Drug overdose out west somewhere, Carol said, dabbing her eyes with tissue. We tried to help him, sent him to family for rehabilitation, but the addiction was too strong. He died alone, probably in some crack house or abandoned building. Their fabricated version of my death revealed how completely they had convinced themselves of their own lies. In their minds, I had become a cautionary tale about drug addiction, rather than the victim of their scapegoating and abuse. Did you ever consider that your blame might have been misplaced? I asked carefully. The question triggered immediate defensiveness. Robert's jaw clenched, while Carol straightened in her chair, both clearly uncomfortable with any challenge to their established narrative. We lived with both boys for 20 years, Robert said firmly. We knew their personalities, their influences on each other. Caden was always the instigator, always pushing boundaries and encouraging Dylan to rebel. Yet Dylan's criminal behavior escalated after Caden's death. Rather than improving, I observed, testing their logic. Carol's face reddened with emotion. Dylan was traumatized by losing his brother. The grief sent him into a downward spiral that led to all these legal problems. If Caden hadn't corrupted him first, Dylan would never have turned to crime. Their determination to maintain their false narrative, even in the face of contradictory evidence, was remarkable. They had sacrificed their house, their savings, and their community standing to protect Dylan. Yet he had responded by becoming exactly the criminal they had once falsely accused me of being. I'll need to interview Dylan personally to assess his case, I said, moving toward the practical aspects of legal representation. He's being held at county jail without bail, Robert explained. Visiting hours are limited, but we can arrange for you to meet with him as his attorney. I agreed to visit Dylan the following day, knowing that face-to-face encounter would provide the moment of truth I had been anticipating for years. Unlike my parents, Dylan possessed intimate knowledge of my physical characteristics that would make recognition inevitable. The meeting concluded with standard paperwork and fee discussions. I offered to represent Dylan at significantly reduced rates based on their financial hardship, a gesture that brought tears of gratitude to Carol's eyes. They had no idea they were accepting charity from the son they had murdered in everything but body. After they left, I sat alone in the conference room, processing the emotional complexity of seeing my parents reduced to desperate supplicants, begging for help they didn't realize was coming from their supposedly dead child. The power dynamic had reversed completely, but the victory felt hollow rather than satisfying. That evening, I called Emma to discuss the encounter. She listened carefully as I described their complete failure to recognize me, their continued adherence to false narratives about my supposed corruption, and their genuine desperation to save Dylan from consequences they had helped create. "How do you feel about helping them after everything they did to you?" Emma asked. "Conflicted," I admitted. "Part of me wants justice, but another part recognizes they've already paid a heavy price for their choices. Dylan destroyed them more effectively than any revenge I might have planned." The jail visit was scheduled for the next morning. Dylan would be the first family member to see through my transformation and recognize the brother they had all conspired to exile and destroy. That confrontation would determine how the rest of this reunion would unfold. I spent the evening preparing for multiple scenarios. Dylan might deny recognizing me, might beg for mercy, might try to manipulate the situation for his benefit. Whatever his response, I would finally have the opportunity to look my brother in the eye and let him see exactly what his betrayal had motivated me to become. The climactic moment was less than 12 hours away. Caden Morrison had died 8 years ago in Wyoming. Tomorrow, Dylan would meet the successful attorney that dead boy had become. County jail visiting rooms always felt sterile and hopeless, designed to strip dignity from both inmates and visitors. I sat in the attorney consultation area, wearing my best suit and carrying a leather briefcase that announced my professional success. The contrast with my last conversation with Dylan 8 years earlier couldn't have been more dramatic. He shuffled in wearing Orange County jumpsuit, his once athletic frame now covered with prison tattoos, and the hardened expression of someone who had spent significant time in correctional facilities. The golden child our parents had sacrificed everything to protect looked nothing like the promising teenager they remembered. Dylan slumped into the plastic chair across from me, avoiding eye contact while he examined the legal documents I had spread across the table. His court file revealed a pattern of escalating criminal behavior that validated every prediction I had made about his character years earlier. "Mr. Morrison Frank," he began formally, "my parents said you might be able to help with my case. I know it looks bad, but there are circumstances that explain what happened." I listened silently as he launched into a familiar routine of excuses and deflection. The robbery was someone else's idea. He was coerced into participating. The video evidence didn't tell the complete story. Each lie rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, suggesting he had been manipulating authority figures for years. "Dylan." I interrupted calmly. "Look at me." He raised his eyes reluctantly, probably expecting another lecture about taking responsibility for his actions. The moment our gazes met, I watched recognition dawn slowly across his features. His face went white as paper. The practiced lies died in his throat as he stared at characteristics that no amount of physical development could completely change. My scar from the childhood barn accident remained visible on my left wrist, the distinctive mark he had helped create during one of our few positive memories together. "You're supposed to be dead," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the small room. "They said you died from an overdose. How are you here? How is this possible?" "I did die," I replied quietly, maintaining professional composure despite the emotional weight of this moment. "The brother you knew died the night you chose to destroy him, rather than accept responsibility for your own choices." Dylan's hands shook as the full implications became clear. The successful defense attorney his parents had begged to save him was the same brother he had framed and exiled to protect himself. The irony was so profound, it seemed fictional rather than real. "Caden, please." He began, desperation replacing his earlier confidence. "You have to understand I was scared. I was 18 and facing serious time. The lawyer said making you the scapegoat was the only way to avoid prison. And our parents believed every word because it was easier than accepting that their golden child was a criminal." I continued, keeping my voice level, despite years of suppressed anger. His next words surprised me. "Don't tell them who you are, please. They've suffered enough losing both sons. Let them keep believing you're dead." The request revealed Dylan's continued selfishness, even in this moment of ultimate confrontation. He wasn't concerned about our parents' emotional well-being. He was terrified that my survival would expose the lies that had destroyed our family. His primary worry was protecting himself, rather than healing the wounds he had helped create. "They haven't lost both sons," I corrected him. "They chose to sacrifice one son to protect the other. Now they need to face the consequences of that choice." Dylan's facade crumbled completely, as he realized his manipulation tactics wouldn't work on me. Years of courtroom experience had taught me to recognize every form of deception, and his desperate attempts to control the narrative were transparent and pathetic. "What do you want from me?" he asked, tears streaming down his face. "I'll confess to everything. I'll tell them the truth about what really happened. Just please don't destroy what's left of our family." His plea forced me to consider what justice actually meant in this situation. Revenge would be satisfying, but ultimately empty. Our parents had already paid an enormous price for their choices, losing their home, their savings, and their community standing. Dylan faced 20 years in prison, regardless of my personal feelings. But truth needed to be served even if delayed by 8 years. I spent that evening crafting a strategy that would reveal the truth while serving justice, rather than mere vengeance. My parents deserved to know that their supposedly dead son had not only survived, but thrived, becoming everything they had claimed I would never achieve. They needed to understand how their choices had consequences beyond Dylan's criminal behavior. The next morning, I called my parents to request a follow-up meeting. "I've reviewed Dylan's case thoroughly," I told Carol over the phone. "There are some family matters we need to discuss before I can provide effective representation." They arrived at my office filled with hope, believing their attorney had discovered some angle that might save Dylan from his lengthy sentence. Robert carried a folder of character references, while Carol brought photo albums showing Dylan's earlier achievements. They were prepared to do anything necessary to protect their remaining child. I had prepared carefully for this revelation. On my desk, I placed my childhood school photos, academic awards from high school, and the newspaper article about Dylan's first arrest that had started this entire nightmare. Physical evidence would be more powerful than simple verbal explanation. Before we discussed Dylan's defense strategy, I began slowly. "I need you to understand something about your family history." Carol and Robert exchanged glances, clearly confused about why their attorney was focusing on personal matters rather than legal strategies. I handed them my high school graduation photo, watching their faces as recognition dawned slowly. Carol gasped audibly, while Robert's hands began shaking uncontrollably. The successful attorney they had been consulting was their supposedly dead son. "This isn't possible," Carol whispered, examining the photo with trembling fingers. "Caden died 8 years ago. We held a memorial service. We mourned him." "You mourned the son you chose to exile, rather than the son who actually died," I replied calmly. "Dylan is facing 20 years in prison, while I became the defense attorney you desperately needed." The emotional impact was immediate and overwhelming. Carol collapsed into her chair, sobbing uncontrollably as the magnitude of their mistake became clear. Robert stared at me in shock, unable to process how completely wrong they had been about everything. "We thought we were protecting Dylan," Robert said weakly, his voice barely audible. "You were protecting your comfortable illusions about which son deserved your love," I corrected him. "The truth was too painful, so you chose lies that justified your favoritism." The conversation that followed was painful, but necessary. They needed to understand how their choices had affected not just me, but Dylan as well. Their refusal to hold him accountable had enabled his criminal behavior, rather than preventing it. Carol's admission came through tears. "We told ourselves you were the problem because accepting Dylan's guilt would have meant admitting we failed as parents." Robert added his own confession. "Easier to blame you, then question why our supposedly good son was dealing drugs. Their apologies felt genuine, but insufficient. Words couldn't undo 8 years of exile or repair the psychological damage their betrayal had caused. However, their recognition of their mistakes was a necessary first step toward any possible reconciliation. I agreed to represent Dylan professionally, while establishing strict conditions for our family relationship. They would need to publicly admit their lies about my death, confess to the community that they had wrongly accused and exiled me, and accept responsibility for enabling Dylan's criminal behavior through their refusal to hold him accountable. Dylan's trial proceeded with me providing competent legal representation, despite our personal history. I didn't hide evidence or sabotage his defense, but I also didn't perform miracles. The prosecution's case was strong, and Dylan's criminal record eliminated most plea bargaining options. The sentence was 8 years rather than 20, a reduction based on competent representation, and Dylan's finally accepting responsibility for his choices. He would serve his time with the possibility of rehabilitation, rather than facing the hopelessness of a life sentence. My parents faced their own consequences within our community. Admitting that their supposedly dead son was actually a successful attorney who had overcome their false accusations required explaining years of lies to friends, neighbors, and church members. Many people who had supported them during their grief felt manipulated and betrayed. The gradual rebuilding of our relationship required careful boundaries and realistic expectations. I invited them to my wedding with Emma, testing their willingness to accept me as an independent adult, rather than the scapegoat they had created in their minds. Their attendance and behavior at the ceremony demonstrated genuine progress in recognizing my worth. Uncle Frank's memorial service provided another opportunity for healing. My parents met the man who had loved and supported me during my exile, learning how much Frank had valued the character they had refused to recognize. His ranch became a place where we could build new memories without the baggage of our shared history. Dylan's prison time allowed for his own reflection and growth. Regular correspondence revealed genuine remorse for his role in destroying our family, and his participation in rehabilitation programs suggested real commitment to change. Prison had forced him to confront the consequences of his choices without parental enablement. The foundation I established in Uncle Frank's memory provided legal aid to falsely accused family members, offering hope to others facing circumstances similar to mine. Emma and I built the practice into a regional resource for complex family-related criminal cases combining our prosecution and defense expertise. Years of therapy helped me understand that forgiveness benefited my emotional health more than continued anger. My parents' choices had been cruel and unjustified, but clinging to resentment would limit my own growth and happiness. Forgiveness didn't require forgetting, but it allowed for moving forward. The final lesson emerged slowly. True strength comes not from revenge, but from rising above betrayal and choosing justice over vengeance. My family's destruction of my identity had motivated me to build something better than what they had taken away. Their worst moment had become the catalyst for my greatest achievements. Dylan was released after serving 6 years with good behavior. He returned to a family that had been fundamentally changed by confronting their mistakes. Our relationship remained cautious, but respectful, built on honesty, rather than the manipulation that had characterized our childhood dynamic. My parents aged considerably during this process, but they also gained wisdom about the cost of favoritism and denial. They learned to value truth over comfort, even when that truth challenged their preferred narratives about their children and themselves. Emma and I built a successful marriage based on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice. She understood that my drive to protect innocent defendants stemmed from personal experience, and she supported my mission even when it conflicted with prosecution goals. The ranch in Wyoming remained my sanctuary, a place where I could remember Uncle Frank's love and the strength I had discovered during my darkest period. His legacy lived on through the legal foundation and the values he had taught me about character and integrity. Looking back, I realized that my exile was both the worst and best thing that ever happened to me. Without my family's betrayal, I might never have discovered my true potential or developed the skills necessary to protect others from similar injustice. Their cruelty had unintentionally created someone stronger than I ever would have become under their continued favoritism and low expectations. Justice was served not through revenge, but through truth. My survival and success proved that their assessment of my character had been completely wrong. Dylan's criminal behavior validated my predictions about the consequences of avoiding accountability. Our parents' financial and social destruction resulted from their own choices rather than any vindictive action on my part. The deepest satisfaction came from knowing that I had overcome impossible odds through determination and hard work rather than luck or charity. Every achievement belonged to me, alone earned through sacrifice and perseverance that my family's betrayal had made necessary. Have you ever faced a situation where family members turned against you during your darkest hour? How did you find the strength to rebuild your life when those who should have supported you chose to tear you down instead? Share your stories in the comments below. And remember that surviving family betrayal can make you stronger than you ever imagined possible. Thank you for listening to my journey from exile to justice. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe for more real-life stories of overcoming adversity, and share it with others who might need hope that survival and success are possible even after complete family abandonment. Your support helps these stories reach people who need to know they're not alone in facing family betrayal. Remember, sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to let others define your worth or limit your potential, no matter how much power they think they have over your life.